I can see her lying back with her angry face, like a bug-eyed alien from outer space. Sundown, you better run like a fox if I find you've been sniffing around her ballot box. Sometimes I think it's absurd when you're the damn incumbent and you finish in third. She's been looking like a queen in a drag king's dream, but I wouldn't want to touch it with a 10-foot beam. Sundown, you better run like a fox if I find you've been sniffing around her ballot box. Sometimes I think it's a drag when you ask for a mayor and they give you this hag. I can picture every move that a mayor could make, but flouting your own lockdown was a huge mistake. Sundown, you better run like a fox if I find you've been rooting around in her ballot box. Sometimes I think that it's sad when you can't rig the vote because you're losing so bad. I can see her looking glum in her cargo jeans. She's a dark-hearted woman and hellaciously mean. Sometimes I think that it's sad when you can't rig the vote because you're losing so bad. Sundown, you better run like a fox if I find you've been rooting around in her ballot box. Sundown, better run like a fox if I find you've been sniffing around her ballot box. Sometimes I think it's absurd when you're the damn incumbent and you finish in third.
Operator, can I help you?
Phone home. Phone home.
From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where Canadianity isn't just a state of mind, it is a poutine-fueled way of life. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant, and major channel announcement right at the start. YouTube has seen fit to make me, of all people, a podcaster. What that means, I don't have the faintest idea, but for whatever it's worth, the playlist with the mainline episodes on it is now, for better or worse, a podcast. And who knows, maybe this just means I will be on a whole new set of shadow ban lists. In fact, that would probably be my first guess. But you know what? When you're getting shadow banned by the worst people in the world, wear it as a badge of honor, I say. Hope you enjoyed tonight's opening number. I know I did. In fact, I could spend every day for the rest of my natural-born life mocking Lori Lightfoot and not feel one single pang of guilt. But enough about that idiot. Good riddance to her and her weird, angry face. We have another cool, really cool anniversary today that's got a fairly good story attached to it. Now, if I told you today is the 247th anniversary of the first ever combat action in the history of the U.S. Marines, or the Company of Continental Marines as they were then, you might not find that especially surprising or noteworthy, but if I asked you to guess where that action took place, Would you say the Bahamas? If you answered no, well, then you may find the following story to your liking. And if your next question is, why the hell would we be trying to invade the Bahamas 4 months before we had even declared our independence? Well, the short answer is because we were trying to steal a whole shitload of gunpowder from the British, and Fort Nassau is where it happened to be located. And why did we have to go to the Caribbean to steal freaking gunpowder? I'm glad you asked. But to set the scene, we have to travel all the way back to Lexington and Concord, the shot heard round the world, April 1775, the first hostile action of the American insurrection. It's not correct to call it the American Revolution yet. It doesn't become a revolution until 4 July of the following year, when we officially and publicly forswear our allegiance to the British Crown and our intention to pursue by force of arms a total political separation from the mother country. The colonial governors, they know they've got a problem now, but at first they're hopeful that it's just going to be a Massachusetts problem, that it can be contained before the contagion of armed resistance starts spreading to the other colonies. And their first proposed solution was, because of course it was, well, let's just take all their guns away. But they quickly thought the better of that because, come on, that's just too damn provocative. That makes us look exactly like the cruel tyrants they say we are. It has the potential to just make matters worse instead of better. But you know what we could do? What if we just quietly removed all the gunpowder from the magazines where we stockpile it for the lawful use of the local militia? We'll do it in the middle of the night, on the down low, and if the insurrectionists try to rise up again, sure, they'll have their muskets, but where are they going to get the powder? And so the royal governor of Massachusetts orders the plan to proceed. We're going to quietly empty out the magazines, load the powder up on some Royal Navy ships out in the harbor, and take it off to the West Indies, where it's close enough at hand that we can bring it back if we should happen to need it, but the rebels can't get their hands on it for their own use. But they didn't carry off the plan quite as surreptitiously as they might have liked, for they were discovered fairly quickly by the locals, and there followed in Massachusetts a period of public discontent known as the powder alarm, where the people said, wait a minute, that's the militia's powder for the militia's use. What the hell legal right do the king's agents have to confiscate our gunpowder and sequester it in the Caribbean? And here begins one of those periods, one of which we're currently living through, where you can determine a person's political views by the words they use when they talk about things. So if you were a patriot, you called it the militia's powder. And if you were a loyalist, you called it the king's powder. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, they were convening a Second Continental Congress to try and decide what to do about the events at Lexington and Concord, and ultimately, over the course of the next 15 months or so, to chart the direction from insurrection all the way to revolution. And down in Virginia, though there had been no open hostilities there as yet, the governor, Lord Dunmore, he didn't much like the rumblings he was hearing from over in the House of Burgesses. In fact, there was some maniac, rabble-rousing insurrectionist named Patrick Henry who had just given a speech in which he declared, "Give me liberty or give me death." Lord Dunmore didn't think that sounded very much like an affirmation of loyalty to the crown. So he very quickly decides, you know what? Maybe those guys up in Massachusetts have the right idea. Maybe we need to empty out all of our magazines in Virginia too, and pronto. And it turns out Patrick Henry wasn't just blowing smoke up everybody's ass with that liberty or death talk, because the very next day, he personally rides out at the head of the militia to take possession of the Williamsburg Powder Magazine, which is the biggest powder magazine in British North America at the time, in the name of the free citizens of Virginia. But he wasn't quite fast enough, because just in the intervening 24 hours, Lord Dunmore had the magazine emptied out and all the powder safely stowed aboard 3 Royal Navy vessels out in the harbor, all of which immediately weighed anchor and departed for the Bahamas. The people in Williamsburg, well, they were well and truly pissed. In fact, Lord Dunmore got so freaked out, he issues a proclamation that says, now look here, people. If you assholes get any ideas about armed insurrection, be assured, I will declare all the slaves free, and I will give them weapons to kill you with. Needless to say, this didn't do a whole hell of a lot to quell the rising tide of insurrectionist fervor, so you confiscated our gunpowder that we paid for that's intended for the use of our militia, and now you're basically threatening to have us murdered by our slaves if we complain about it. So now pretty much all the gunpowder in Massachusetts and Virginia is safely ensconced, or so the thinking goes, at Fort Nassau in the Bahamas. Far beyond the reach, or so the thinking goes, of those damned insurrectionists. Meanwhile, back in Philadelphia, by the early part of 1776, the writing was starting to be on the wall. Whereas in the minutes of the First Continental Congress, you'll see that they are replete with fawning, obsequious expressions of loyalty toward king and crown and a desire for an amicable conclusion to the present troubles, but there is little to none of that in the minutes of the Second Congress. And once this stuff starts happening with the confiscation and removal of the gunpowder, it starts to be seen as increasingly a foregone conclusion that these 13 colonies are, and by right ought to be, free and independent states. And that an official public declaration to that effect is going to be forthcoming probably sooner than later. Although, as a practical matter, it's a distinction without a difference, since there already is open war, irrespective of whether you choose to call it an insurrection or a revolution. But wars are notoriously difficult to fight without gunpowder. And the two most populous colonies have now effectively been cleaned out of the stuff, to the extent that there are domestic facilities capable of producing more. They're either not big enough or not reliable enough, or they're located in loyalist strongholds like New York City. So if we want to fight this thing and actually have a chance of winning, well, it looks like we need to dispatch a force to the Bahamas and get our damn powder back. And so the Continental Congress issues orders to that effect, and the fleet, with the newly minted company of 200 Continental Marines, sets sail from Cape Henlopen, or however the hell you say it, Delaware, early on the morning of Saturday, 17 February 1776. There are 8 ships in the squadron, and some of these you will recognize as the namesakes and forebears of some very famous later vessels. Hornet, Wasp, Columbus, Alfred, Fly. Yes, we had a ship called the Fly, captained by Jeff Goldblum. Providence, Columbus, Andrew Doria, and Cabot. And though by today's standards it might sound fairly absurd that it would take 16 days to get from Delaware to Nassau, it was fairly middle of the road for the age of sail, and also kind of an upset for that day and age is the fact that you've only got 2 vessels that got separated from the rest of the squadron. Could have been worse. But here's the problem with surprise naval attacks in the 18th century. If an enemy ship happens to leave the same port on the same day as you do, and their ship is faster than yours, then he's got time to get to your target, inform the local commander of the size and disposition of your force and its intentions and the hour and day when you're likely to arrive, and then he has a magnificent 8-course meal. He enjoys fleshy congress with half a dozen Bahamian ladies of the evening, and he does it all again the next day before your ass finally arrives on the scene and you commence your surprise amphibious attack. And here's the thing about amphibious attacks in the 18th century. This ain't Utah Beach on D-Day. You don't ride in on an armored landing craft right up to the edge of the beach and then the ramp drops open and you come out shooting. Nah, in 1776, you didn't get to start shooting until you had rowed your damn self all the way from wherever the ship is docked. The ship that you've just been on for 2.5 weeks, possibly retching your guts out the whole time. So needless to say, you're probably not exactly in your optimal fighting shape when it's time to start fighting. Combine that with the fact that the local commander has had 48 hours of advance notice of your arrival and your intentions, and thus plenty of time to empty out the powder magazine that you came here to capture and load it on a few ships that were leaving for New England anyway. And it becomes clear fairly quickly why the Marine anthem begins with the halls of Montezuma and the shores of Tripoli without any mention of the beaches of the Bahamas. Because the thing wound up being really quite a spectacular clusterfuck. Though it has to be said, technically, on the scoreboard, it was an American victory. They conquered the fort that they set out to conquer because the commander politely surrendered, having already divested himself of the gunpowder the rebels had come to capture in the first place, so what the hell does he care? They cleaned out whatever munitions were left in the place. They did get a couple dozen barrels of powder, probably as a consolation prize more than anything. They occupied the fort for 2 weeks, and the U.S. Continental Marines, well, they could enjoy a nice Caribbean vacation and revel in the fact that their lifetime record was now 1-0. The local commander in Nassau, for his part, the worst casualty he suffered was that the Americans drank every single thing in his liquor cabinet, and thus begins another proud devil dog tradition. So while, on the one hand, this expedition was kind of a ridiculous comedy of errors, it was also something we could credibly call a military victory, and we didn't really have any of those at this stage, so we will take what we can get. But on the way home, rather than being satisfied with an unsatisfying victory, our guys got a bit full of themselves and decided they were going to have a sea battle with a Royal Navy detachment where the biggest ship of the other guys, HMS Glasgow, a sixth-rate ship of the line, or a frigate, depending on which side of that argument you happen to be on. Well, that one ship pretty much outgunned our entire squadron by herself, and the battle went about like you would expect it did, because being outgunned always trumps being outnumbered in a naval battle. So HMS Glasgow kicked the ever-loving shit out of our guys, almost sunk the Cabot, grievously wounded her captain, killed about a dozen of our men. And we called that a victory too, since the other guys withdrew voluntarily after they were done kicking our ass. And hey, every journey has to start with a first chapter, doesn't it? Today, the U.S. Marine Corps is arguably the most legendary fighting force in the history of armed human conflict. Its exploits just in the first half of the last century will live on in the annals of military history, and rightly so, for many thousands of years. But it's kind of like the first season of The Office. Sometimes you wind up doing an awesome, legendary thing, but the first chapter is sort of an awkward, embarrassing piece of shit that you would prefer to forget. It happens to the best of us. Semper Fi. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Hope you had a nice week. Hope you have a nice weekend. See you when I see you. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.